Jeremiah asks a question. He says, "Who is the wise man who will understand this, and whom the mouth of God has spoken to him? Let him say, over what has the land been lost? Why did the Jewish nation lose the land of Israel?" And he responds, chapter 9, verse 12. "And Yahweh said, over their leaving my Torah, over their abandonment of my law, which I gave before them, and they did not listen to my voice, and they did not walk with it." Modernly, the Jewish people have returned to their biblical homeland. And there are many issues that come to the forefront when a nation that has been exiled from its land for 2,000 years finally decides to return. The obvious question is, what right do you have to be there? There have been other people living there for 2,000 years. Now you come back and claim that it's yours? The answer is because God gave it to the Jewish people. It is very clearly stated in the books of Genesis and Exodus, as God swears to our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that he will give the land of Israel, then known as the land of Canaan, to their descendants as an eternal inheritance. And so what does an eternal inheritance mean? It means that for eternity, that land belongs to the children of Israel. This is a very unique claim that is made. No one else can make the claim that the God of the universe gave them a plot of land. But that is the truth of the matter with regards to the nation of Israel. And so, now that the nation of Israel finds themselves back in their land, what exactly should they be doing there? Well, it's made very clear in the Bible that if the Jewish nation does not follow God's Torah, if they do not observe his laws in his land, then they will be subject to the greatest curses that will ultimately result in them being evicted and thrown out of the land that they have been promised. If you look at the state of Israel today, it is a self-proclaimed secular state. It does not observe at all the commandments of the Bible. They're governed by democratic laws, by their own whims and their beliefs, and they do not pay any heed to the laws of the Torah, the laws of God. Now, with all of their wars that they have and all of their political unrest, all that the Israelis seem to care about is the opinion on the world stage. They care about what the United States thinks, they care about what the universities think, and they care about what all public perception is. What they fail to recognize is that public perception matters not at all. The only one who they need to worry about, the only one whose approval the nation of Israel needs, is God. Because God created the world, God created the Jewish nation, and God gave them that land. And so how do you have secular people who claim ownership to a land if they deny that it's God who gave it to them, and they deny that they need to be following God's laws in the land that he gave them? It's extremely hypocritical, and it doesn't actually make sense. And all of this confusion is made manifest in the internal politics with Israel and their foreign policy and the way that they interact with all of their allies and enemies. When Moses led the Jewish people to the promised land and they arrived at the land of Israel, he made sure to tell them that it was God's judgment that all of the nations living in the land were to be wiped out. Now again, this sounds like a very harsh judgment, and it is. And it's actually a judgment that only God himself can make. And so in that time, they were commanded to actually wipe out all of the nations that were residing in the land at that time. And Joshua, who led the Israelites into the land, carried out that task. In fact, he made sure to tell the Jewish people that the few nations that they didn't manage to get rid of would actually serve as a snare and a trap and a thorn in their eyes because they were now living amongst nations that were not part of the same faith. They were now engaged with cultures and practices and beliefs that were not representative of the Torah of God. And so it's not that it needs to be a state of only people who are bloodline Jewish, because the Bible acknowledges converts and sojourners and those who live amongst the Jewish people. But the important thing is the Torah. It's the law of God, that we may not stray to the right or the left from the law of God. And that's something that needs to be implemented on a national scale in the land of Israel. And that's something that is non-existent today. Ridiculously enough, these secular leaders of Israel would invoke biblical references in order to justify using excessive force against Palestinian civilians. Benjamin Netanyahu even quoted the verse regarding Amalek. Amalek is a very specific scenario in the Old Testament where God commands the Israelites to wipe out an entire nation, men, women, and children. Now, that is a specific nation at a specific time in history. Yet, this secular man, who doesn't care at all about the laws of God, will invoke that law out of context to justify killing men, women, and children without real discretion. And that's frankly unholy and against God. And so the one time that God is invoked, it's actually to justify a negative course of action. And there's something to be said about this, because those who wish for the Palestinians to have their own state in Israel and stay in the land, that is not in line with the biblical view. And certainly, the Jews need to pay the price for having been gone from the land for 2,000 years. And there are people that live there, and they have no right to just go ahead and kill them. But I do believe that on the basis of the laws in the Bible, Israel does need to be an exclusively Jewish state. It needs to be a state that's governed by the laws of God, not by the laws of the secular government, not by the laws of the rabbis, but by the laws of God himself, which is what he expects from his people and his land. In terms of how to deal with the nation that is currently living in Israel, I do not think that indiscriminate killing is allowed at all. In fact, I will read to you the law in the Bible that pertains to this scenario. It says here in Deuteronomy chapter 20 that when you go out to war against a nation who is not one of the nations that God commanded to wipe out. So there are two different categories of nations. There are nations that God tells you to wipe out completely. And that is a very rare occurrence, and it only happened then in history. At this moment in history, we have no right to point to the people living in Israel who are not of Jewish descent and say they're all deserving of death. That's not actually accurate at all. So the law that applies to them would be this one. You go out to fight them, and you should call out to them for peace. And if they answer you in peace, then they surrender to you and they're under your rule. But if they call out for war, then you go out to war. Now, you may have to go out to war, but what do you do in war? Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 12. And if they do not make peace with you, and they make war with you, and you besiege them, and God gives them into your hand, then you shall strike all of their males by the sword. Only the women and children, and the animals, and all that is in the city will be to you as the spoils of war. In other words, males who are threats in war, who are soldiers, they gotta go. But women and children, they should be saved. They are part of the spoils of war, but they are not part of the casualties of people that get killed. In fact, women and children should be considered in the context of war. And it is not just something that can be done to get rid of them. and claim that you can just kill people at random and at will. And that's definitely wrong. So Israel is truly faced with a difficult dilemma, and they need to act in accordance with God's law and no one else's. And frankly, they are hearing criticism from all sides. They're hearing, on the one hand, you should give full rights to a state, to another nation, to basically exist in your land. You should have another nation's country in there. I don't think that that's reasonable, and I don't think that that's biblical. I think that biblically, the law is that the entire land is an inheritance for the Jewish people for all eternity. However, when it comes to dealing with the inhabitants of the land, you should not kill them at will and at random. You should offer them peace, and if they do not accept peace, then you go to war with them. But in war, women and children are spared, and they are not considered to be just meaningless lives that you can get rid of. The nation of Israel's only concern should be to obey their Lord, who has given them this opportunity once again, after thousands of years of exile, to return to his land, to return to the heritage that they were promised to their forefathers. And yet, at this crucial moment, the Jewish people in the land are so far away from being connected to God and from being truly aware of what his commandments are, because his commandments are not what the government says, and his commandments are not what the rabbis say. His commandments are found in the Torah of Moses, in his revelation that he has given from the dawn of the Jewish nation. And that is what we have to reference in order to know how to live. And the state of Israel will not be able to boast that it's a democracy. They will not be able to get public approval from everyone, but they will know that they're in the good graces of God because they value his commandments and they follow his laws, and they value human life, and they value the inheritance and the possession of the land, that they can actually turn it into a place of true holiness and a place where there is every 7 years a Sabbath of the land, and 3 times a year there is a pilgrimage to the temple. Because if we can build malls and skyscrapers, we can build a temple. And there definitely needs to be people coming together in order to take real action to restore the biblical frame that has been lost from amongst the world, but most importantly has been lost from amongst the people whom God charged with the responsibility of upholding these laws, of living in his land according to how he laid out the plan.